Thanks. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. And thank you, Niels and colleagues, for the generous invitation to speak at this conference of the Society for Intercultural Philosophy. So let me just start by saying that I'm an architect, and my contribution, I hope, pertains to theoretical questions around the nature of spatial experience. So in what follows, I propose to trace the significance of spatio-environmental experience in the constitution of concrete generative relations. In doing this, I want to introduce an operative concept following Eugen Fink's terminology that I derive from the late works of Edmund Husserl. The term that Husserl uses in German, and pardon my pronunciation, is Umweltlichkeit, which I render in English as environmentality. I'll examine the significance of this term as one that indicates the generativity of spatio-environmental experience through reference to the concrete context of landscape experience in the Caribbean. I'll draw on current research I'm developing on spatial theory that engages with the work of scholars in Caribbean social history and my own fieldwork on the Caribbean for two projects. One is a documentary film on Trinidad and Tobago, where I'm from, titled Possible Landscapes. I'm working on this project with two collaborators, Natalie Melas, postcolonial scholar, and filmmaker Kanan Arunasalam. The other project is on the historical and contemporary lived experience of plantation landscapes and their afterlives in Guyana. And I'll just note that the images I show from these two projects, the photographic images are my own, and any film footage is from Arunasalam. So this work, in terms of my own motivations, both continues and expands my examination of Husserl's writings on space and generativity, which was the topic of my recently published book. So let me begin with the appearance of the landscape as a theme in the work of the Guyanese historian Walter Rodney. A country, Guyana, geographically situated in South America, but through its historical experience of first Dutch and then British colonialism, is sociopolitically and culturally tied to the Caribbean. Rodney begins his study of the emergence of a free laboring class from out of the plantation experience in Guyana during the post-emancipation period around the mid-19th century, with an epigraph from a novel by his compatriot, the writer Edgar Mittelholzer. The canal flowed with calm, telling nothing of what it knew, of the rainstorms and high winds, and of the droughts of years gone by, of the stench of dead cows and the thunder of purple clouds. So the epigraph is drawn not from a work of poetry, but rather from Mittelholzer's novel, Quarantine Thunder, about a peasant family in rural Guyana. Rodney here poeticizes Mittelholzer's prose, extracting it from its narrative setting as the grounding environmental horizon for the life of its subjects, an Indo-Guyanese family in the rural plains of the Quarantine River. In using this passage, Rodney conflates historical experiences, the labor involved in the construction of a vast engineered landscape by African slaves, and relations to the landscape that characterized the post-emancipation period, which was marked by a tension between free labor and indentured servitude, specifically that of new migrant populations from British colonial territories in India and China. So it's not easy to unravel the fine threads that form the fabric of this geotemporal interlacing. Rodney's gesture, his poeticization of the experience of the landscape through reference to literature, indicates that he has a conception of the landscape as facilitating certain modes of experience. He's concerned with the temporality of the landscape as a factual horizon of historical experience. This, I propose, Rodney shares in common with the meditations of Husserl on what he describes as the openness of the landscape. That is, the peculiar manner in which the environmental horizons of life are experienced not merely spatially, but as having a certain temporal and historical quality across generations. Husserl frames it in the following way: openness of the landscape, knowing that I have arrived at the borders of Germany, then arriving at the French, Danish, etc. landscape. I have not paced off and become acquainted with what lies in the horizon, but I know that others have become acquainted with a piece further on, and then again, others yet another piece. I appropriate to myself the reports of others, their descriptions and ascertainments, and form universal representations. So let us consider briefly such a description, although not of Germany and its horizons, but of a former landscape of sugar production in Trinidad. So in the spring of last year, my colleagues and I interviewed two women, a mother and a daughter, who had worked in the sugarcane industry as indentured farmers. No, it's not as independent farmers. Sorry, this is much later than the indentured period, although they're ancestral ties, as independent farmers for many years, until the closure of the industry in Trinidad in 2003. So here is the description that they gave of what the landscape used to be like during the harvest season.
Right. And then when they have harvest time, so harvest will begin November, and it will finish somewhere into, I think it's early April, like March and April. They'll start clearly marking the starting of preparation for harvesting. And once that harvesting starts and it's completed, we will actually visually get a whole image of what the landscape, how beautiful it is to look at. Because you're looking at fields, prepared fields from here to all central. It's 2-point-something miles away plus. All directions where cane goes, all directions. Beautiful. Clear view. You're seeing all the way to the other side of Shogunas. That's how beautiful it was to look at that landscape. That is no longer existent.
So the women characterized this landscape, which no longer exists in the same way, as beautiful, through a description in search of a memory that is typical. Theirs is a shared intergenerational memory, one that does not reach back to the lived experience of an historical context of indentured servitude of South Asian migrants and African and Creole enslavement. As regards this, the question of slavery, we have the following characterization from Rodney. The Dutch in the Guyana colonies were capitalist entrepreneurs. They were few in number, and they merely supervised the labor of Africans subjected to slavery. The Venn Sugar Commission of 1948 estimated that each square mile of cane cultivation involved the provision of 49 miles of drainage canals and ditches and 16 miles of the higher level of waterways used for transportation and irrigation. The commissioners noted that the original construction of these waterways must have entailed moving of at least 100 million tons of soil. This meant that slaves moved 100 million tons of heavy, waterlogged clay with shovel in hand, while enduring conditions of perpetual mud and water. So in this lecture, I consider conceptions of historical becoming and understanding as tied to the experience of post-colonial landscapes. The reference to the post-colonial condition and raises the concrete and situated question of the affective, generative, and historical nature of the lived experience of environing world in landscapes characterized by colonial inheritances. Here, the landscapes of the Caribbean serve as paradigmatic. So in an article of 1981 on plantation society in the post-emancipation period in Guyana, Rodney raises certain critical methodological questions around the study of Caribbean historical realities, which imply what could be framed as an ethics of empathy. His is an attempt, quote, simply to understand our society, to understand our past in a context of a profound underdevelopment of its historiography, end quote. Rodney notes that the historiographic problem is first and foremost one of approach. By this, he's raising an ethical question that is at the heart of the methodological one. It has to do with what the philosopher Valentin Mudimbe would characterize as Einfühlung, using the German term in order to indicate, quote, the sympathy towards oneself and one's culture, end quote, that this type of research calls for. This phenomenological category has important implications for historical research that is attuned, as Rodney's is, to problems of spatio-environmental experience. The observation that Rodney viewed the landscape of Guyana as having profound and particular significance for the historical becoming of its society was made by the Barbadian author George Lamming. Lamming, speaking of Rodney, states, it is indicative of his sense of priorities, his critical realism as a historian, that he should deliberately focus our interest on the peculiar character of the landscape. It is not just a casual reminder that this coastal strip of Guyana was hazardous terrain. It is the emphatic and persuasive way he situates men and women in nature. He plunges us into the sodden realities of mud and feces, the menace of flood, either from the sea or from overwhelming torrents of rain. This recognition of and attention to spatiality, the spatiality, material quality, and physicality of labor in the landscape and the nature of its embodiment are important aspects for Rodney's wider methodological and ethical concerns that to him are essential to take up in order to properly address the problem of an historical lacuna. Rodney identifies it as follows. It is a whole historical era, post-slavery era, that just has not been seriously dealt with by a large number of historians. To compound the matter, there is another historiographical difficulty, the question of approach. The one which exists is by and large not ours. Very often it is not even a sympathetic analysis. It is not one that seeks to achieve empathy with the Guyanese people. This short passage from Rodney takes us in two directions that are related. Firstly, there's the purely historiographic question of research into the immediate post-emancipation period. This is tied, secondly, to what Rodney characterizes as an approach of empathy. The problem of empathy here pertains to a certain possibility of access to the concreteness of the lived experiences of newly emancipated persons, not as an abstract historiographic formality, but as a matter that has significance for people's lived experiences of these landscapes today, as a kind of colonial heritage, we might say. Rodney's concerned primarily with the manner in which this historical population formed itself into a free laboring class. But the matter for him is not simply about the relations of labor and the new forms of conflict that arise. Rather, Rodney effectively asks about the constitution of community in the post-emancipation period at the intersubjective level of the family. He emphasizes, if one is going to explicate the actions of the workers, one must appreciate that they became aware of their labor, that their labor must not be given to the planters as family labor. They were beginning to articulate a notion of what a family unit was. This focus on the formation of community at the level of the family is significant for concrete descriptions of generative phenomena in the Guyanese context specifically. Furthermore, it has, by extension, important theoretical implications for an analysis of generativity that thematizes the colonial-postcolonial relation more generally. Here, I want to linger on the motif of the family as a way of approaching the concept and phenomenon of generativity. Generativity is a phenomenological notion that appears in the late works of Husserl. The concept does not feature prominently in Husserl's writings published during his lifetime, but is a theme that runs through his manuscripts published posthumously in the Husserliana volumes, specifically those dedicated to problems of intersubjectivity, the life world, and historicity. Although Husserl does not develop the concept systematically, Anthony Steinbach has argued convincingly that the movement of Husserl's philosophy led him in his later writings toward what Steinbach has termed a generative phenomenology. Steinbach's analyses are intricate, revolving around a dyadic structural relation between the concepts and phenomena of home world and alien world. Here, although I draw on Steinbach's seminal contributions, I approach the phenomenological notion of generativity as it appears in Husserl's work from a different aspect. I want to consider the concept in a more concrete and even literal way, having to do with questions of birth, the experience of labor and maternity, spatial affectivity, the lived bodily acquisition and accrual of habitualities, the constitution of intersubjective and intergenerational bonds at the level of the family as a horizon of community, and the wider phenomenon of sociality to the limit of what Husserl terms community of love, Liebesgemeinschaft. Most importantly, I want to inquire into these phenomena from the point of view of the colonial, post-colonial experience of the landscape. In other words, from the aspect of the spatial heritage of this experience of landscape that I characterize as its environmentality. Before turning to this, however, I want to qualify my reference to the themes of the colonial and the post-colonial. What I want to indicate is the relation of the colonial to the post-colonial. Here, my reference to post-coloniality is not merely as an index of periodization or chronology, having to do with the achievement of political independence of former British colonies in the Caribbean. I'm also not using the term in the wider theoretical and polemical sense that applies to the global geography of European colonialism, or further, the more generalized and expanded sense with reference to colonialism as any project of power, domination, violence, and territorial appropriation. My use of the term is simpler, delimited, and situated in reference to a tradition of Caribbean historiography and its effective historical structure, to use an expression borrowed from Hans-Georg Gadamer. In this lecture, I'm referring explicitly to the work of Caribbean historians who were writing with a consciousness of the effective historical conditions of possibility of their own research into the colonial history of the Caribbean. They were writing within their post-independent present, and with a consciousness of the significance and implications of their work for that present and the open horizon of a post-colonial future. What for them was an anticipatory horizon of the future at that time, as anthropologist David Scott points out, is for those in the Caribbean today a lived experiential present. It is the contemporary situation from which I myself am writing. The affective motivational structure of this temporal intertwining as a dynamic movement, past, present, future, is complex. But what I want to indicate here is that access to the colonial is only possible through the prismatic lens of the post-colonial. I'm working across experiential and discursive horizons that are interlaced, and thus their relation is not straightforward. The lived experience of a post-emancipation landscape then, or approximate access to this through a tradition of Caribbean social history, and the significance of this for understanding the generativity of our post-colonial present. Now, the concept of environmentality that I'm proposing derives its sense from a descriptive analysis of generative phenomena and their relations. Generative phenomena are fundamentally intersubjective, although they are experienced and accessible only through the spatio-corporeal intimacy and irreducibility of each individual subject in its particular experience of its finitude. For Husserl, it is not limited to purely anthropological conditions. He speaks of animal generativity, generativity pertaining to plants, and he even considers the question of the generativity of unicellular organisms, Einzeller. One can speak at length about this, but here I follow Steinbock in that it is through a concern with the generativity of human community that the spatio-environmental horizons of experience appear in their significance. In the context of the Caribbean, historically, the spatio-environmental horizons of experience of the enslaved and subsequently freed population and new migrants bound to the colony by indentured servitude were determined by the plantation landscapes and their infrastructures. And then increasingly to date, the fragmentary ruins of these landscapes, the village, urban, and peri-urban settlements. Now, an important dimension of Husserl's discussion of generativity involves a descriptive analysis of lived bodily corporeity. This concerns the acquisition of habitualities and their manifestation as an abiding comportment and somatic style as a habitus. That is, the concrete emergence of the subject as an individual person. This means that birth and pregnancy are implicated. Husserl points to the particular constitutive nature of the spatiality and intersubjectivity of pregnancy, natality, and maternity, which he would refer to in somewhat enigmatic language as a first empathy, erst Einfühlung, as that between mother and child. The relation is characterized by certain drives or impulses and communicative tendencies and possibilities, in terms of which Husserl would relate lived bodily corporeity to a conception of love. He writes, I can allow myself to be determined by others through imitation. I can impulsively want to help them. There exists an impulsive maternal love, paternal love, an impulsive care, which in its fulfillment is joy in their well-being. Naturally, there is also an immediate impulsive sympathy with their sorrow. Here, Husserl is thinking through problems that concern, as Sophie Lloyd-Holt puts it, the question of, quote, what it means to be ethically affected, end quote. Sarah Henheimer discusses the manner in which pregnancy is constitutive as a lived bodily experience of the woman, pointing to both its experiential passivity and activity as the woman's capacity, as well as its precarity. It is the concrete condition through which a generative nexus is made possible in the constitution of the family. Husserl would characterize the sociality of this concrete generative nexus as, quote, being together with direct generative comrades, end quote. And he would frame its spatiality in terms of the shared experiences of iterative situations, such as what he terms the common meal. Husserl emphasizes the idea of the constitution of generative bonds through social acts that are necessarily determined by a certain temporariness and occasionality, which, through regular iteration, become abiding and normative practices. He talks about like having dinner, for example. In this way, we can speak of a level of environmentality that is intimate in its intersubjective constitution. In other words, a level of spatial experience characterized by a style of intimacy with others that he terms the family. By family, Husserl means phenomenologically a level of community within which the individual's emerging and transforming lived bodily corporeity becomes increasingly determined as a habitual style, inherent to which is the condition of being with others in reciprocal processes of lived bodily formation and stylistic recognition. In this way, individual habitualities acquire and maintain as inherent to them as lived bodily style, intersubjective significance. Husserl is concerned with the ethical implications of the family as a level of community in the constitution of the wider social world. For example, community at the level of shared language or linguistic community, and what he terms volitional community or community of will, Willensgemeinschaft. That is, community founded on mutual recognition, association, and shared purpose. So here it's important to emphasize that Husserl's analyses, even in their fragmentary nature, while aiming at the ideal of ethical community, recognize intrinsic constitutive problems of inequality and subordination, such as in the formation of certain types of what he terms artificially established communities. For example, master and servant, and the distinct category of relations of slavery based on coercion. So I want to dwell here on Husserl's fragmentary consideration of relations of slavery. He writes, in artificially established communities of equals and subordinates, the functions, that is, duties, are voluntarily taken on the basis of an arrangement, or, as in relations of slavery, through imposed coercion of the subordinates. But a volitional togetherness, a volitional unanimity also produces a personal bond. This bond becomes actually ruptured when the members themselves refuse to fulfill their duty. The slave who has escaped, the maroon, is no longer actually a slave. A slave rebellion breaks the master-slave relation. Force, the suppression of the rebellion, establishes the relation again, and the expression is appropriate, provided the new relation becomes conscious of itself as a continuation of the old. The slave recognizes the obligation, and also the obligation retrospectively for the time in that he had broken it. This extraordinary passage by Husserl appears in a manuscript fragment in the second Husserliana volume on intersubjectivity. given the title Sociality and Ethics, the Function in Community and Obligation, Community and Society. In this fragment, Husserl actually begins with a consideration of the constitution of the family and the nature of bonds and obligations that arise. He writes, each member of the family is a responsible subject, a subject that has a generally defined and, in a special case, particular I ought that belongs to this generality. This lasting I ought indicates here the naturally mature obligation. And this itself has a general content that generally defines the obligatory as the meaning of the obligation, as in the particular case, the definite, special, or specific obligation. We say father, mother, etc., have such and such functions. From this perspective, we understand the family as a personal connection that has a shared value as its goal. That is, carries within itself a common aspiration, an ultimate purpose. That purpose is for each member of the family, while at the same time, each has their own unique purpose, defined through the unity of the overall purpose. So what I want to draw out from these passages is not so much the question of the master-slave relation and its rupture through rebellion. This, for my purposes, is thematically secondary. Rather, what I want to recognize is the presence of the question of slavery in Husserl's meditations on sociality, and that he points to the subjectivity of the slave in the context of a discourse on generative phenomena at the level of familial bonds, relations, responsibilities, and obligations. I want to inquire into the nature of these generative relations that primarily concern relations between enslaved persons themselves. The transformation of these relations in the post-emancipation period that would become relations between freed persons and then continuously so. In these considerations, the master-slave or master-servant relation is not denied. Rather, I don't give it priority here. It is important to keep in mind that my investigations here concern the concrete historical conditions of plantation-based economies and society of the modern Caribbean, and that what I'm after is a descriptive analysis of the spatio-environmental conditions that are constitutive of the generativity of this Caribbean landscape. So let us start with a question concerning the generativity of slavery, its possibility and its negation. With regard to this question of the possibility or negation of the generativity of slavery, the paradigmatic response is given in the work of the sociologist Orlando Patterson in the form of his concept of social death. Social death has its basis not only in certain absolute relations of violence and powerlessness experienced by the individualized subject, quote, as a substitute for death, but also and more profoundly at the intersubjective level in what Patterson terms natal alienation. This term implies a complete severing of generative bonds and an absolute negation of such connections, actually and in potential. Patterson frames social death as a negation of generativity at the level of natality in the following way. The definition of the slave as a socially dead person, alienated from all rights or claims of birth, he ceased to belong in his own right to any legitimate social order. Not only was the slave denied all claims on and obligations to his parents and living blood relations, but by extension, all such claims and obligations on his more remote ancestors and on his descendants. He was truly a genealogical isolate, Formally isolated in his social relations with those who lived, he was also culturally isolated from the social heritage of his ancestors. Slaves differed from other human beings in that they were not allowed freely to integrate the experience of their ancestors into their lives, to inform their understanding of social reality with the inherited meanings of their natural forebearers, or to anchor the living present in any conscious community of memory. So the context for Patterson's discussion here is a comparative analysis of slavery as a phenomenon and institution across historical and geographical extents, from the ancient world to the modern institution that formally ended in the 19th century. In this way, as a generalized comparative study, Patterson's thesis is to a certain extent abstract. If it is regarded in reference to the modern historical experience of Caribbean slavery, it does not lose this quality of a certain abstraction. But more to the point, I want to suggest that it functions to indicate what can be characterized, borrowing a term from Steinbock, as a limit phenomenon. Patterson draws our attention in a remarkably precise way to the question of the generativity of slavery as a limit problem. It has to be approached from as close to the ground as possible. That is, we have to try to understand the concreteness of the lived experience of historical persons in the Caribbean at that time. So here I want to turn towards Rodney's discussion of the immediate post-emancipation period in Guyana. As I've already noted, Rodney starts his historical study of the newly freed population and recently arrived indentured migrants of post-emancipation Guyana with an epigraph that describes the landscape. It is not merely a scene, rather he wants to present a visual and haptic image of the environmental horizons of sugarcane plantation along Guyana's coastal plain, and the labor involved in the structuring of this landscape. So working with and through Rodney's seminal studies of concrete spatial conditions of Guyana, I want to pick up on generative themes in their relation to his descriptive attention to concrete spatial conditions. Seen in view of this interest, the problem of the family and its spatial horizons emerge as a central theme, one that implies certain phenomenological latencies regarding the lived, bodily, and sense-perceptual basis of what Husserl terms feelings developed over time, with a certain iterative continuity of situations, and that lasts or persists in the form of a habitus. Feelings of a personal connection as a function of having grown together in community and in common spatial environmental horizons. So here it's important to emphasize that Rodney's discussion of the family is focused on the emancipation period, roughly the mid to the late 19th century, but he wants to show us that this has implications for our conceptions of slavery as a lived experiential condition. He notes, maybe our ideas about slavery have misconstrued it a little. It strikes me that the Blacks would not have been able to do what they did unless, under slavery, they had established some prior network. There had to be means of communication. This idea that the plantation was a discrete unit that isolated everyone from everybody else is false. That is what the planters would have liked. That is what they advocated. But obviously, the activity of the oppressed went beyond these boundaries. So they must have had links amongst themselves. Rodney here is referring specifically to industrial action in Guyana in the 1840s, but he's also making a wider, more general point regarding certain conditions, dispositions, deliberate actions, and spatial practices of the newly freed Black populations, that they almost instantaneously assumed. These were expressed concretely in the formation of village communities. This is what Rodney wants to emphasize, and particularly so in the specific historical context of Guyana. The principle that Rodney indicates here is that enslaved persons, based on our understanding of post-emancipation realities, but also our understanding of slavery, would have necessarily constituted nexuses of generative relations to varying extents that could transgress the violent and limiting conditions of slavery establishing other modalities of affiliation and alliance in the formation of intergenerational community. In the post-emancipation period, these villages were founded effectively in the landscapes of former sugar plantations. In a Benjaminian sense, we might say they constitute the afterlife of these landscapes. It is this afterlife that Caribbean writers point us toward poetically. Derek Walcott, in his epic poem Omeros, that traces the life of a fisherman in the island of St. Lucia, writes, "The horned island sank. This meant they were far out, perhaps 20 miles over the unmarked fathoms. He stood as the swift suddenly shot past the hull, so closely that he thought he heard a cry. Our only inheritance, that elemental noise of the windward unbroken breakers, Ithaca's or Africa's, all joining the ocean's voice, because this is the Atlantic now, this great design of the triangular trade." Achille saw the ghost of his father's face shoot up at the end of the line. Here, Walcott points to a swift in flight as the protagonist Achille is guided by the bird's kinestheses across the Atlantic from his Antillean home to Africa. The environmental space itself has a peculiar historical quality in Walcott's poetry. Its image is only partially metaphorical. In the intergenerational handing over of experience, the environmental space is also handed over as an inheritance, as a mode of relating to the environment. Through the image of Achille being led back across the Atlantic to Africa by the sea swift as his guide, Walcott foregrounds the environmental reverberations of historical experience. As he would say, the sea is history. So in concluding, so my current research on the Caribbean, I'm examining this question of generative continuity and rupture. I take as my starting point the contemporary situation, its poetization and narrativization in literature and in everyday speech, and subjects embody lived experiences of their surrounding landscapes and spatial horizons. I consider the peculiar manner in which the corporeity of the environing world effects a touching that moves the lived body, not merely by its perceptual presence, but rather carries the motivations of absent others through its presence. So let me conclude with some general notes on the concept of environmentality. I know the time is passing, but yeah. So the notion of environmentality, and here not necessarily speaking about the Caribbean context specifically, but speaking more theoretically about the idea, the concept. The notion of environmentality can be traced out in the form of a conceptual and phenomenal arc. We can start with a thematization of natality, which is characterized by a peculiar intersubjective relation, phenomenally and descriptively accessible as lived experience only through the lived bodily experiential style of the woman. It is in this way that a generative nexus is concretely constituted, actually and in potential. At the level of the becoming of the subject in its personal individuality, its birth, growth, and aging, arises the continuous acquisition and accrual of habitualities inextricably tied to intimate relations with others in processes of being together and growing together, in which these others are present to the necessarily embodied subject in typical situations, the environmental quality of which acquires the sense of familiarity. It is a familiarity that manifests as a lived bodily style. The environmental context within which this lived bodily corporeity sediments as a style is a generative context, one that involves iterative situations by means of which shared motivations, affections, and attachments are constituted. Each person in the generative nexus experiences in some way differentiated yet related iterative situations that extend towards increasingly generalized experiences of sociality. With the other's death comes an absolute distance from my having relations with her as lived bodily relations. It is not merely distance from the other's lived body, but it is a distance from the possibility of the appearance of the environing world within which the other was given to me perceptually as lived body, as this way of the environing world's appearing. The perceptual givenness to me of the environing world is now colored by remembrance. Mutely, in the absence of the deceased, my lived bodily style carries on. In this way, at the level of lived bodily corporeity, deceased others continue to be with me environmentally. The surrounding world becomes a category of the beloved. I'm going to skip a bit because of time, but here I'm sort of these images I'm talking about those kinds of experiences. The peculiar kind of fogginess of memory and the movement back and forth between memory and remembrance. I'll skip this video. So I want to close with a short passage by Husserl. He says, human existence, human life is played out as horizontal in the constant and constantly moving tension of familiarity and unfamiliarity, nearness and distance. That is always environmentally, in a relativity of this environmentality. In other words, in the relativity of the worldly situation. And in this movement lies its constant historicity, its own and that of its environment. So in its very speciality, as lived bodily experience with others in intergenerational community, this environmentality incorporates the generativity of the landscape and the intimacy of one's spatial horizons. Thank you very much.